Welcome back, everybody. This is Anthony from linuxacademy.com in our Cloud Cadet episode 5. You'll have to forgive me. I'm a little washed out on the screen right now. I have 5 monitors going. I'm working on tweaking that as we continue going on Cloud Cadet. So it might look like there's a big blast of something coming at me. So please forgive me for that. And with us today, we have Christoph co-hosting. Christoph, say hello.
Hello, how you doing?
Christoph is also the host of the awesome ScaleYourCode.com podcast. Tell us a little bit about that, Christoph.
Yeah, it's a podcast where we talk about all kinds of things, but more specifically just scaling systems, large systems like at Twitter and Google and all those big sites. So it's really fun. We also talk about performance and other things like that. So check it out.
Absolutely. And today we are featuring instructor Terry, who has a little bit to talk about and show in regards to the new Linux Foundation Certified System Administrator certification, which was just updated on February 2nd. And with that, we announced our updated course with objectives and exercises and performance-based practice exam. Terry, tell us a little bit about that and what they actually changed, what that means.
Well, hi, everybody. So with the Linux Foundation at the latter part of last year announced that they were making changes to the certification for the system administrator. And by the time that we got to the first of the year, they were on version 2 point something, and it turns out that we ended up with version 2.16. And what they did is they significantly increased the domain competencies that you have to be familiar with in order to obtain this certification. They also added whether you call it a weighting system or a distribution system for the categories that you can expect certain questions to come from for their exam that's more specific than version 1 was. So we updated our course so that it matches exactly the domain competencies for the version 2.16, which went live on February 2nd. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the changes, and then we've got a demo for you on KVM since it's a brand new section, virtualization for 2016.
Fantastic. And what we're showing here is a blog post written by Terry that's available on linuxacademy.com/blog, which talks about these changes, which talks about performance-based practice exams available and the assessments available as part of preparing for this certification. So, Terry, if you're ready, are you ready to go ahead and do a demo? What are you going to show us today?
Well, actually, I was just going to kind of walk through the sections first, and then when we get down to virtualization, I'll show you a demo. So,
yeah, that's great.
In the past, we only had 4 categories that were very loosely coupled in terms of the topics and domains that you needed to have experience in. Well, they're a lot more specific, and we've expanded that in version 2.16 to 7 major categories: essential commands, operation of running systems, user and group management, networking, service configuration, storage management, and virtualization. In our blog post here, if you go to linuxacademy.com/blog and go to this particular announcement, it'll tell you those categories and then the percentage of questions that you can expect between each of those categories. Now, right now, it is still a performance-based system, and if all the way down at the bottom, we do tell you that it can be anywhere between 28 and 50 questions, depending on how they pick what questions in each of these categories. You need a 74% still to pass, which is the same as version 1 in 2015. But they've got a better distribution of the domain competencies, and they cover a wider variety of command topics. So you can expect to see things that in version 1 you didn't see until you got to the Linux Foundation Certified Engineering exam. Well, they've added categories for SMTP, basic DNS management, some more advanced networking and service configuration. However, there's still things that I would expect a system administrator to be able to perform. And it seems like they're kind of drawing the line between an administrator and an engineer, between an administrator who does more or less basic or more daily tasks, and an engineer is somebody that an administrator would escalate problems to and or would have to do more complex configuration topics. However, they did introduce a new section for virtualization, and you can see that it's only 5% of the domain competency questions that you can expect, but it is a completely new competency for this particular version. So I thought since it was completely new, I could take you through a few of the things and talk about what we talk about in the course.
So what it really kind of looks like, if we compare the public exam objectives here to, like, for example, the RHCSA public exam objectives, it looks like if you've already started or prepared or qualified RHCSA, you're pretty close to also being able to go and take the Linux Foundation Certified System Administrator too, since they've added in the virtualization and storage management on there. So my assumption is in that storage management, there's some LVM and other such items in there as part of that certification as well.
Yep, that's absolutely true.
Okay, now if you don't know, and if you want to, of course, you have vendor neutral, which Linux Foundation considers themselves as vendor neutral for certified system administrator. And then you have Red Hat, which is just specific to Red Hat. And of course, is now basically CentOS, and CentOS is a fork of it, and it also works on Fedora. So basically, at Linux Academy, we have the Red Hat Certified System Administrator prep course, and we have one specifically built for Linux Foundation. So if you're gearing towards one or the other, you can take the course that's focused on what you want to do, and then go over to the next one if you want to get both and kind of fill in some of the gaps and make sure you have just the other essentials on there. So there is a little bit of overlap on there. However, you're able to take which one you want to focus on at Linux Academy rather than just a generic course that works for example, LPIC, Linux Foundation, and Red Hat. We have all three available to you. And so this is just one of those that we've kind of pumped up there for you. So Terry, I'll let you go ahead and continue. I just wanted to kind of point that out for our Cloud Cadet listeners.
Sure. So one of the things that we talk about is we take a physical running system. And one of the limitations that you have to keep in mind from a KVM perspective is although we take you through a full installation on a system that's not currently running it, in order to get KVM working correctly using QEMU, it has to have hardware virtualization support, which limits us in things that we can do in a virtual machine. So we actually have a physical piece of hardware that we've installed, in this case Ubuntu on, but it can just as easily be CentOS, so that we can run 64-bit OSs and have a memory footprint larger than 4 gigabytes. So we take you through the introduction, the download and configuration of your system, as well as the installation of the GUI. And here's where the Linux Foundation exam is unique in that because it's a performance-based exam, you can accomplish what the questions ask you in several ways. In other words, you can do it through the GUI, which is available, or you can do it at the command line. So what we do in the course is we give you both options. We show you how to create virtual machines, how to take snapshots and those kinds of things, as well as manage the state of the machine. So the KVM portion of this exam is very basic. How do I install a virtual machine? How do I take a snapshot? How can I start it and stop it? So we'll show you how to do both things through the GUI as well as through the virtual shell, which is often referred to as VIRSH or VIRSH. So once you have your system installed, so we've got two items running here. We've got a console here, and then we've got the virtual machine manager. And again, in the course, in terms of configuration setup, we show you how to do both. So we've got the our system running, and I've already installed a couple of virtual machines. But through the GUI, if you've ever installed a virtual machine, whether it's through virtual desktop or the web interface for VMware ESX or VMware Workstation or for VirtualBox, it's very similar in that you have a machine manager that you simply create a new virtual machine through, and it takes you through a pretty easy to figure out GUI that will allow you to pick an ISO, do a network install, etc.
Hey, Terry, quick question.
Sure.
I just want to point out, I believe the package to install that virtualization manager is actually virt-manager. Is that correct? I think it's similar to that. So if you don't have it already installed, you can do if it's depending on the distribution, right? So I believe on CentOS and Red Hat, it's virt-manager.
It is on Ubuntu and Debian too, and we go through that during the installation and configuration, yes. But You're right, it's virt-manager, and when you run it the first time, you do need to run it as sudo, but again, we cover that in the course.
Very good, thank you.
All right, so we've got a local install media, and we're just going to run through a couple of the screens that will end up with the virtual machine installed. Obviously, we're not going to install for a full virtual machine because it takes 20 or so minutes. So In our case, we had an ISO image. So we would go to browsing for the ISO image, and we had downloaded a CentOS 6.7, which is the latest version of CentOS. And we chose that volume. Now, from an OS type, you can just leave it as generic Windows or Linux. Obviously, we're doing Linux in our case, and just as in VirtualBox as well as VMware Workstation, there isn't a specific listing for CentOS, but since CentOS is based upon Red Hat, you simply can pick the Red Hat Enterprise Linux and the appropriate version. Here's where we indicate that we have the memory and CPU footprint we want. 1 gigabyte and 1 CPU is fine for the purposes of this demonstration. We can change our storage amount. It will always suggest 8 gigabytes, as will VirtualBox and VMware Workstation. I recommend that you do at least 18 when you're doing a full install of CentOS. About the same for Ubuntu or Debian, although 16 is generally enough. You can also select or manage other existing storage. So if you had something you wanted to attach to it here, we could do that here. And we'll talk a little bit about storage when we look at the XML at the command line that actually builds the virtual machines.
Can you always go back and add a disk to it or storage to it once you've already created the machine?
Yes, and in fact, once we get this virtual machine, I'll show you the settings screen where you can see that. So we're going to give our virtual machine a name. By default, it'll default to RHEL 6, which is fine because we're not going to actually do the installation. And then we would hit finish here, and it would set up a virtual machine that we would have to start over here. So now what we end up with here is we end up with a virtual machine that's currently not running, that we can go in and we can look at the settings for. So again, if you've ever used any kind of a GUI to install virtualization, a guest operating system, it's very similar to things that you would have seen in VMware or Virtual Desktop or VMware Workstation. It has on the left everything that is specific to the features for your guest operating system. In this case, we have a CentOS 6 box that we've named _test. We have some monitoring capability, but we have the ability to change our CPU configuration and whether it is running a specific number of cores or sockets, the amount of memory that we've allocated to our instance. And here, for example, where we see our virtual hard drive, we can go down here to add hardware, and we can add an additional hardware device, a network device, graphics device, sound, etc., including an additional disk image, or selecting a disk image that exists that we can attach to the storage. So we can do all of this as long as the machine is off, or we can even do it while the machine is live, but it won't actually reflect the changes until you shut the machine off and turn it back on. So the hardware screen is extremely similar to pretty much everything else. And we can start it from within the GUI just by powering on the virtual machine from right here. And all this does is it boots the virtual machine as if it were being booted anywhere else. We can turn off, we go over here, and we can see that it runs CentOS 6.7 pretty well. And I'll tell you that from a KVM perspective, if you've ever used VMware Workstation or you've used VirtualBox, you know that one of the first things that you'll do from a performance standpoint is you would want to install the guest tools on it because it enables, graphic acceleration mode. It enables your storage to be faster. In our case, because we're running KVM on a Linux kernel, we can forego any of the guest tools because everything is optimized already for this particular operating system. So unless you're running Windows, you don't have to install any guest tools. Now this is great here. It's running the full virtual machine. But what you're going to generally want to do, if you're running a server, you don't have to run the virtual manager GUI. You can do everything that we just did through what's called the virtualization shell, and it's called virsh. So if, for example, I want to execute a single command, I can simply type virsh and list, and this will tell me all of my virtual guests that are currently running. If I want to know all of the guests that are currently installed but not necessarily running, then I can just do a --all. That's kind of a simple way of interacting with my virtual shell. However, if I'm going to do multiple things, then you may want to start up just the shell itself, in which case we can forego the virsh command in front of everything. We can just do list dash dash all, and it'll do it in the context of that virtualization shell. So I can also control the state of my virtual machines simply by telling it to shut down, for example, the name of my virtual machine that I want it to interact with. So I can manage the state by starting, rebooting, or shutting down, or even destroying, which we'll forego here. We don't want to destroy, which will completely delete the VM using the virtual shell. And we can see that it's now being shut down. And if we rerun the list all, it's telling us that CentOS 6 test 1 is still running, but eventually it'll be shut off. If I go over here to the CentOS 6 test 2, if we go over to open it, and I'm just going to bring up the settings here where you can see all CentOS 2 was, CentOS 6 test 2 is a clone of CentOS 6 test 1. So I didn't have to install my virtual machine twice to get 2 copies of it. I simply right-clicked on it, cloned it, gave it another name, and then it cloned the exact operating system into a whole new virtual machine. So whether you're developing a template, whether you just want something that you can mess around with and then destroy, and then we could have snapshotted as well. But for example, if I'm running a virtual system that I don't have a GUI installed on, again, I can use virsh to manage my entire guest operating systems no matter how many I have. For example, if I wanted to look at what's the configuration of one of my systems, I can do a DOM info and then the name that I want to look at. So if I want to know, for example, CentOS 6 test 1, what does my configuration look like? I can look and see that I have 2 gigabytes of memory allocated to it and 2 CPUs just by knowing what the name is. And DOM info is short for domain, and that's how KVM manages guest operating systems, as they're members of the domain. In this case, it happens to be the local host because this is all on the same system. And just like I could go to my settings in each of the virtual machines in my virtual machine manager, I can change my memory or CPU settings exactly the same way at the command line. And all I have to do in this case is, for example, to set max mem for the VM that I want to set it for, CentOS 6 _ test 1, and then I want to set it to 3 gig. And now if I rerun the DOM info command, it'll show me that before we had 2 gigabytes of memory set as my maximum memory, and now 3 gigabytes of memory. And I could have run that command live if I had done a dash dash config at the end, although it would only have applied after I rebooted the system. So anytime I add storage or basically any hardware, it's only going to reflect those changes on the next system restart. Well, how would I build a virtual machine if, for example, I didn't have a GUI, a brand new one? Well, one of the things that I can look at is I can dump the XML for the virtual machines that I have. So if I wanted to, for example, dump XML, which will just show me the XML file for CentOS 6 _ test 1, then what I can do, and this is actually probably better to do outside of the virsh command, is I'll just do virsh dump XML CentOS 6 test 1, and we'll just say test XML. And now I can edit that test XML, and it shows me what the XML does to create one of my virtual machines. So I can just now edit the XML file, point it to different storage. The only thing that I would have to make sure I removed is the UUID, which will be regenerated when I import it through the virsh command by doing a create. So again, it's covering a lot of basic information from a virtualization standpoint for KVM. And I know here at Linux Academy, Anthony, we're going to be launching a full KVM deep dive course at some point this year. Am I right?
It's scheduled.
So you'll get to see a lot of this kind of stuff, but these are the basics. And in our course, we probably tell you a thing or two more than you need to know, but it's always better to have more information than you need than less information than you need. Kind of just a basic demo of virtualization in KVM.
Is there anything that really jumps out that you can't do in the virtual machine manager GUI interface, or do they both kind of match when it comes to what they can do?
So in the case of the virtual machine manager and the command line, they can do exactly the same thing. And the reason is the virtual machine manager is actually in the background running the same library of commands that the virtual shell actually runs. So if we look at the virtual machine creation in the GUI, if we saw the command on the back end, it would be a very long verse create command that would pass in all of those parameters, writing it to the XML, and then importing that into the creation process. So they're actually completely identical. And if you need a list of the commands that Virch can run, when you're in the Virch command shell, you can simply hit help, and there's thousands of things that you can do for managing all of the guests in all of your different domains.
Yeah, essentially, it can all be done with the command line. You don't even have to use the GUI.
That is correct.
It's an option.
That's correct. But we give you both options, especially from an administration standpoint, being kind of the first level certification. Some are going to be more comfortable in the GUI than at the command line. In your case, and for preparation for the exam, you can do either one, and we show you both.
Yeah, and if you're focused primarily on being able to pass that exam, right, there's a lot that you have to know. And I know what we focus on in like the RHCSA course is we're going to try to keep some of the shortcuts if there's shortcuts, because there's just so much stuff you're going to have to remember in an exam. You're going to be under pressure. It's going to be a tough environment. So we always I always encourage, and I know you do too as well, we provide that information to be able to do on the command line. But if you can do in the GUI 3 clicks, something that requires, and I think launching, and correct me if I'm wrong, from the last time I did it not too long ago, launching those VMs on the command line is a little bit more than just 3 clicks worth of effort, right? You have a lot of options you have to pass into it, such as memory and whatnot. So it can be a little bit time consuming to build the command for it, whereas in your certification, you have a timed exam. So you absolutely want to take shortcuts when you can. If you can do something in 1 minute that would take you 10 minutes to do at the command line, but you can do it in one by launching the GUI, launch the GUI, absolutely.
Yep, and in fact, even if you take the exam and the virtual machine manager GUI is not installed, as long as it's in the repository, you can install it on your test system. That's perfectly within the rules. So if you're asked a virtualization question, you're less familiar with the command line, more comfortable in the GUI, all you got to do is a sudo apt-get or yum install virt-manager, and in a minute, you'll be ready to go using the GUI panel.
So I see you have a section on how do I prepare. So can you tell us a little bit more about how people can get started with this?
Sure. So obviously you want to take our course to cover the new domains and competencies you're expected to be familiar with. But it's the only thing that we provide. Not only do we provide an end practice exam that gives you anywhere from 0 to 140 questions across all these domain topics that can be pulled from, but we've got these hands-on exercises so that you actually can get your hands dirty, being asked the same questions that you might be asked. Now, when I say the same questions, I mean the same type of questions that you'll see on the exam. For very obvious reasons, we couldn't, even if we wanted to, provide you with the exact questions and answers that you'll see during the exam. But they're questions that are in the spirit of those in the same domains and competencies. If you can be confident that you've got those correct, then you'll be confident that you can pass the exam.
And that's a great point, Terry. And that's just something that we like drilling down is when you're preparing for something, stop trying to focus on exam dumps. Stop trying to understand exactly what they're going to ask you. Instead, go to understand what you're doing and how you're doing it and how to do it and why to do it, so on and so forth, all the different combinations that you can say that, and try to be qualified. Because when you're qualified, guess what? Doing this isn't hard. I mean, if I understand correctly, you can have access on the LFCSA, access to man pages and info pages. And if you know how to search those and read those, all the answers to your questions are in there. Now, of course, you don't have enough time to just read every single one. So knowing how to do it, and if you get stuck doing it, that's absolutely fair game in there. So, try to be qualified rather than focus on exam questions. And that goes with whether you're focusing on, for example, LPIC. It's not a performance-based exam. It's one of those question and answer-based exams where you multiple choice answers or fill in the blank. If you focus on understanding and being qualified rather than focusing on just passing the exam, then you're going to be able to ace job interviews. You're going to be able to do your job at the system administrator level or whatever level it is your exam. So absolutely focus on that. Don't focus on just trying to pass the exam. And you'll have a lot more fun and a lot less stress when you're going through the studying and preparation process too. Just a little bit of my 2 cents on that.
I agree. And one of the things to keep in mind, I've taken both the LPIC exams as well as the LFCS, is on the first go through, answer the questions that you know off the top of your head. There's nothing that says that you can't skip around. If there's a question that you need to think about, skip over it, go to the next question, finish what because most of the questions don't build on each other, even in the LFCS where you're actually doing things. They're questions in a microcosm. I don't have to answer question 1 to answer question 2 for the most part. If there's steps in a section, that's one thing, but question 2 doesn't require that question 1 has been answered. So answer the questions that you're confident in and then come back to those that you need to come back to. There's nothing wrong with that. And if you get through 90% of them in the first 10 minutes, you'll feel pretty confident. Not only do you have the time to spend on those that you were less confident on, but that you're probably going to be okay.
You know, I'm glad we kind of digressed into this because now we're going to, from learning something and talking about the exam, to a little bit about exam preparation. And it's very important. And we actually launched a tool back in October that's part of our assessment engine. And with that, we launched with this LFCSA course as part of this blog post that's on there, is our performance-based practice exam. So while you're going to have similar questions, and again, our goal is not to give you the answers of the exam. Our goal is to train you to be qualified. And when you're qualified, passing a certification is a piece of cake. So when you go and you take this very much is like sitting in front of a performance-based exam. You're presented with a set of questions or tasks, essentially, in a performance-based exam that you have to go and perform on actual Linux environments. And so that's where we have, as part of linuxacademy.com, and members have access to this, is this performance-based practice exam. I think we have a huge, huge one for LFCSA, if I recall, Terry, because you were part in building that. Is that correct?
Yes, and with the changes from LFCS, we had about 80 different topics that we could draw on, and it's over 140 now. And again, what you can expect is 28 to 50 questions on the LFCS. And we've got almost 3 times that to draw on in terms of those domains and competencies. So if you look at our blog post, and I've got this up on my screen now, we've got a screenshot of the LFCSA practice exam. And these are the kinds of things that you'll have to do. You'll have to create a file. You'll have to change the order of the contents of that file or sort it. So these are the kinds of questions that you'll see in the exam, and you'll actually be doing those on one of the Linux Academy lab servers. And then once you've got that done, you submit it, and it'll be graded. So however you get the answer, there's multiple ways of doing almost everything in Linux. It's both the great thing and the bane of Linux is sometimes there's too much choice. But in any event, as long as you get the answer right, how you do it is largely irrelevant as long as the result is what it needs to be. And what we do is we grade on that result. You don't have to learn one rote way of doing something. You do things that are comfortable for you and how you are going to function as an administrator to get to the end game.
And the really cool thing about the practice exams, it's also timed. So you're able to kind of gauge how much time you should spend on something. So preparing for exam isn't always just knowing the answers or being qualified to answer the answers or questions. It's also knowing how to use your time. Part of it is just time management, knowing, hey, this type of question, I need to move on, having a feel for where you are, because what you don't want to do is spend 30 minutes on one question where even if you missed it, you might have passed because you answered all the other ones correctly, but not have enough time to get to those other ones because you spent too much time on one that really wasn't that big of a deal. So absolutely, time management's part of preparing for an exam.
Agreed.
Well, that is fantastic. I think, Christoph, do you have any questions?
No, that's great. Thanks a lot, Terry.
Do you have anything to add?
No, that was pretty much everything I wanted to cover. Just definitely take the course. There's a lot of new domain competencies that you'll have to be familiar with. It is a tougher exam this year than it was last year. So just be aware and take advantage of the resources we have at Linux Academy to help get you prepared.
Fantastic. Thanks for coming on and sharing and showing that demo with some virtualization, Christoph. Thank you for taking time out of your day to come and assist in hosting this. And as always, I'm Anthony from linuxacademy.com. Everybody have a great day.